When it comes to mindfulness and when it comes to microhabits, we're kind of sold, especially when it comes to habits themselves. Habits are something that we can all agree upon, that they're super important for us to integrate into our lives. And the good habits, if we have them employed in our lives, are the things that make us successful over time. There's almost no one that would say, oh yeah, I don't need to think about or could be concerned with my habits, my day-to-day activities. The question is, how do we integrate the habits that we want to include in our lives? What habits do we want to employ? And how do we make them synergized with our own intentions of who we want to be as people? There are two things I'd like to start with before we get into the actual, let's say, presentation material, two different micro habits that have to do with the breath. I think one of the main things that we could think about, and one of the best habits that we could probably incorporate into our lives, is this idea of connection. The way that we connect to ourselves and the way that we connect to other people is super helpful to then use as a starting point whenever we're going to do anything, whether it's go to a meeting, work with our family, do an activity. Just a few moments of connection with ourselves and with the people around us can be super helpful. So we're going to employ two micro habits before we even start talking about how to integrate these things. The first is this idea of a deep sigh. And what we're going to do is we'll do this together. We'll do two different things. The first one is we're just going to do a deep sigh, and this gives us kind of an energy and alertness. So we're going to breathe in through the nose like this. And then right at the end, when we feel like we've breathed in like enough, we're just going to breathe a little more like this. And then sigh out. Okay, when you're ready, we're going to breathe in. Let's do three more, just like that, now that we know the system. Breathing in. Two more. One, last one. Before we go on to the second activity, I just want us to recognize for a moment how that makes us feel. By breathing in this way, what we're doing is we're creating an increase in oxygen intake into our bodies. We have in our lungs all these little tiny sacs that get filled with the intake of air, and they expand when we breathe in a deep way. So they expand a little. And when we expand them a little, we have a more increased exchange of oxygen. That oxygen almost immediately finds its way up to the brain, and it can help us to be a little bit more connected. It's something that we can employ at any time. And already I know that from my experience, I can already feel that standing here, but from you that are sitting there and you that are listening to this, when you try this, you really will definitely feel a change, an exchange, a kind of a shift in the way that we feel. And this is super interesting because it doesn't take a long time physiologically to make these shifts, especially if we work with the breath. There's a second breathing activity, and I call it a micro meditation or a meaningful success meditation. And these will be incorporated into the Holistal platform as well. And they're meditations that are like 3 to 5 minutes long. And what they are is they're simple ways to connect with an inner growth idea or mindset. There's a process to it, and the first bit of the process is regulation. So we're going to regulate by working with the breath, then we're going to reflect, and then we'll find a specific point to reflect on. It could be a different inner growth point depending on the day, and we'll go through that when we get there. And there are 50 of them that I've created that we can use, but we'll just do one today. And then the last part of that is respond. In some way, we want to respond because we're people that like to take action. So most of the people who are interested in things in terms of business, they want to be in some way successful or have some kind of drive or agency in their lives. Sometimes they might say we don't have time for, let's say, long meditations. But this meditation can help us to integrate, connect, and then proceed on something that could be important in our lives. So let's do this together. And we're going to start with the first phase of this little 3-phase mini meditation, regulation. So maybe we sort of half close the eyes and we just simply, without really trying very hard, just notice the breath. Now, we're not going to do a long meditation on the breath, but we are going to notice how it feels as it's coming into the body and out again. Notice maybe that it's coming in through the nostrils. Perhaps we can feel that breath into the chest area and maybe even extend it down into our bellies a bit. Notice how just being aware of the breath helps us to feel a little bit more connected. It's a technique that is an ancient technique used by many high performers, used by the Navy SEALs, used in all kinds of companies. And it's simply connecting with the breath and noticing it coming in and out of the body. Before we move to the second phase, we're going to do one more extended step in this regulation, and that is that we're going to increase and deepen the breath, maybe just by 10 or 15%. So 10 or 15% deeper and 10 or 15% longer. And when we deepen and lengthen the breath, we start to use the breath to tell the body that everything is okay. And the body, of course, talks to the nervous system and says, "Hey, nervous system, I feel fine." And the nervous system connects with the brain. And it says you can step away from that sympathetic activity that brought you here, navigating the streets, and engage the parasympathetic nervous system, which allows us to, in some ways, connect with a deeper part of ourselves, but also another part of our brains. The neocortex becomes engaged, and there are scans that show that this is indeed true, simply by deepening and lengthening the breath. And now, while maintaining this deeper and longer breath, we're going to move on to phase 2 of this meaningful success meditation. And phase 2 is to engage a reflection point. Today, our topic is mindfulness and microhabits. And we're going to spend a moment reflecting on how mindfulness and microhabits can be employed more in our everyday life. How can I work with microhabits and mindfulness together and incorporate them into my everyday life? Perhaps things start to turn in our minds. Maybe we're defining the terms. What does a microhabit and mindfulness mean to us? Maybe we have a to-do list or things that come up in our minds that immediately are triggered by this inner growth reflection. and carrying that reflection with us, we're now going to move into the third phase of the Meaningful Success meditation, and that is response. So as we blink open the eyes, we can decide that we're going to be as mindful and present in this presentation as we possibly can be. If we were in a longer workshop environment, perhaps we would journal or talk about or reflect together on what comes up for us during this meditation. But right now we're going to just use it as a way, a springboard into the material that we're going to discuss today. So as I mentioned, we believe in habits. Habits are something that have been on the minds of people for many centuries. But what habits do we want in our lives? And how do we employ them in a way so that we will be successful using them? These are the two questions that come up. As far back as Aristotle, there's been a concern or a thought about using habits or incorporating habits. And Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit." And we all know that incorporating habits leads to some kind of excellence. But it can be very easy to, especially nowadays with all of the self-help material out there, is to have a list of habits that's from the floor to the ceiling, right? You can get up at 5 a.m., do some push-ups, go do some meditation, write in your journal. There's so many things that come up that people say, have a gratitude journal, right? There's tons and tons of things that people want to employ in their lives, and it's hard to know exactly what to do. Well, I like to think that what we really should be starting with is our state of being. That's how do we want to be? And if we start there, then the habits that we cherry pick from all the different things that we could do, from our diet to our training regime to the way that we try to put things in place so we sleep better, all of these things are a lot easier to employ. So we have three basic areas that we work with when we work with habits. We have, of course, the body, and many of the habits that we think about immediately are things that come through the body. Fitness, how many steps, if we're on the step competition at work, if we are, what we eat, all those kind of list of bodily things, and they're super important to incorporate. And of course, Holistal has a whole area dedicated to the body. The mind is a little bit different. Of course, there are some habits that we have we're already sold on when it comes to the mind. For instance, how we read. There are sites like Blinkist to condense books into these small processes, or we have a bunch of podcasts and things that we can listen to. We have audiobooks, all kinds of different mind increasing activities. But one of the things that is also on an upsurge, and it's been there for since, let's say, the 60s, but of course it's been happening for thousands of years, is this idea of meditation, very similar in length to the one that we just did, this Meaningful Success meditation, or it could be transcendental meditation, meditating twice a day. There are many studies that show that we can decrease stress, we can increase connection with ourselves, and we can have better relationships if we are meditating more often. So meditating and mindfulness is a huge way to increase this area. But for many of us, it's kind of might feel out of reach. So if we think about that, it might be something that we can incorporate into our lives. And the third part of this, and this is where we come into state of being from my point of view, is the heart. Who do we want to be as human beings? What kind of relationships do we want to have? And how do we incorporate all the other activities in our lives to make sure that they fundamentally are coming from our heart, from what we truly desire, from the things that really drive us, from our value system. Many times companies put into place all kinds of values, and we sit together around a table or in a strategy workshop thinking about our values. But what values do we have as individuals, and then how do we incorporate habits that are tied to those values? I think this is one of the fundamental things that we really should think about when we're working with our habit forming. And mindfulness is kind of like a bridge, right? When we spend time meditating, being alone, connecting to ourselves, we become more aware of what is in our hearts, and then we can find habits that are integrated and useful for us as we go forward throughout our day, our week, our month, and the year. One of the fundamental things about habits, especially smaller habits, is this idea of incremental change. We know that by doing a little bit every day that we can increase our, let's say, success. And we might not even feel like we're doing very much. But the thing about habits, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, is that if we start to work on them day by day, building up good habits, putting them in place, aligned with our state of being that we want to incorporate into our lives, then the steps are not just incremental one by one. They're actually exponential in some way, to some value. We know that, for instance, maybe today I can do one push-up, and if I do one push-up every day for a week, maybe next week I can do 2 push-ups in a row. And so that kind of thing, we change actually how we are physically, mentally, and also emotionally by integrating habits. The key is, for me, is that we have habits that are aligned with the state of being and the person that we want to be, that we don't take a lot of external habits, because we all have that list of stuff. That list of stuff is very easy. The big thing that's super important is the exact things that we need to do to be the people that we want to be. When we're thinking about habits and incorporating habits into our lives, there are 2 pieces of literature that come up in the habit world that are extremely popular, let's say. There is Atomic Habits by James Clear, and there's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Now, one is macro habits, and the other is micro habits. Tiny changes, remarkable results. And Stephen Covey is talking a lot more about what can we incorporate and how can we be people that are more aligned, right? So those macro habits are things that we can work with as well. I think it's important that we go through them just briefly to get a sense of the literature that's in place already, and then decide what we want to incorporate for ourselves. So I'll just give a brief run through of these. Now, The 7 Habits is a book that really changed my perspective and has helped me incredibly, especially during some big transitions in my life in the past. I was coming out of a relationship, I was changing my job, I was trying to do many different things, and I thought, where do I go? And someone recommended to me The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and I thought, I'll buy this. So I not only read the book, I started to study it, to work with it, to listen to it on tape, and it really helped because it was putting in place a kind of structure, paradigms that could then help me to then put the smaller pieces in place. I'm just going to run through them quickly. The first one is, the first time I wrote this list, I put a bunch of, I thought I was going to write a list from 1 to 7, and as I did it, that ended up being just ones, and I didn't notice that. And then when I went through my presentation, I was like, they're all important. They're all could be number 1. So I left the ones there because I thought, we don't really need to have an order of these things. So that was one of those little small, kind of happy accidents in my life. All right. So the first one is being proactive. Now, we all know the idea of agency, of putting things in place that drive us forward, of asking for the things that we need, the things that we want in our lives. So if we're proactive, that's a great habit to integrate. So the first step would be connection. we know what we want, and then we start to be active in the direction that we want to go in. The second is begin with the end in mind. Beginning with the end in mind is super helpful. We all of us who have had strategies or goals have thought, okay, this is where I want to get to. We can even take it one step further by not only having a goal, but really visualizing ourselves in that goal as having fulfilled that goal. Of course, if you've been interested in any way, this whole idea of manifestation, this is one of those fundamental pillars of that, to have a visualization that towards something that we want to go towards. And athletes are using beginning with the end in mind all the time. They're working with visualization, they're working with crossing that finish line, and then putting all the steps in place based on, again, that person that they want to be, that athletic performance that they want to have. And we can do that as human beings, deciding on what comes from our integrated heart, mind, and body. The third is put first things first. We all, or not all of us, struggle with prioritization, but many times it's very hard to prioritize exactly the most important things. And if we really start to look at things, there are many people who have said something like this. Think of like the 10 things that you want to do in your life. Put them all on a piece of paper. Decide on, put them in a list of what's most important. Cross everything off the list except for the first one. And this is the kind of idea of really prioritizing what we should be doing. A lot of times we have this thing, oh, we have to do all these different things. But maybe we just have to do one thing and do it till it's done, then the next thing. So we're focusing, and that ties us back into this idea of mindfulness, that we spend our attention towards driving towards the one thing that we are doing at that very moment, and not thinking about other things. If I were thinking about, let's say, my kids and the things I have to do right now instead of this presentation, it might distract me, and I might be kind of, my brain might be over here when I really want to be here with you. Think win-win. It's a competitive world, right? We want to win. We want to be the best. We want to be the most successful, whatever it might be. We want things for ourselves, for our families, especially in the environment that we're in today. It feels like people are taking, and not really wanting to share. If you're kind of more of a liberal person like I am, you might be like, yeah, well, let's share. And then it might be hard because someone else might be grabbing and taking. Well, if we're thinking win-win, we're always trying to find a way forward that actually is beneficial to both of us, whoever it might be. And it's really, compromise in this case is really something that we leave behind. We don't want to compromise. That means one person is losing. And usually in this kind of power dynamic, it's someone that feels very resentful. But if we find win-win solutions, if we're open to finding win-win solutions, it can really help us to sort of drive forward. And great connectors know this. They're trying to put people together that are finding win-win solutions to the things that they're doing. Seek first to understand, then be understood. This is the idea that, we don't always have to be the person that's speaking. We don't always have to be the person that's pushing through their ideas. If we really start to figure out and understand what the other people that we're dealing with want, what they need, and how they feel, then we have a better chance of really communicating. And that increased communication can help us to grow as human beings. Synergize. More often than not, once we start to really look for the win-win, when we're involved in kind of trying to understand rather than be understood all the time, we can find synergies. And those synergies can lead us to new possibilities. It could be tech solutions that are coming in, the incorporation of AI, a new group that wants to devise something else that can really work together with us to make our project better. So synergizing is a super helpful way to engage with others. And the last is sharpen the saw. Sharpening the saw is this idea of continually learning, continually trying to be better. There's this quote by Abraham Lincoln that said, "If you give me 3 hours to chop down a tree, I'll spend 2.5 hours sharpening the axe." And this is one of those fundamental things about our lives. If we continually improve, we continually learn, we will indeed be the kind of person that is a learner, that is growing, and that growth will only help us in the long run. So these are 7 macro habits. Let's look at some of the micro habits, or the way to approach micro habits, because what James Clear does is he talks about how to incorporate micro habits into our lives. We saw before that small changes make a big difference. And we kind of know that, right? 1 push-up, 2 push-ups, 5, and then before you know it, we're like Goggins, No, we're not. But we're at least increasing our, push-up thing or whatever, our chin-ups or whatever it might be. And what's important also is it's not just physical. And that is a key thing. As I mentioned in the beginning, we see a lot of the habits associated with the body side, right? But when we start to bridge into the mind and into the heart, that's where real magic happens. I often see people, especially on social media, of course, that are like, they're in business, and then they decide, oh yeah, I'm going to get fit. And then all we see is like photos of them, posing and getting stronger and everything like that. And it's good, right? Super good. And we like that. And yet we know that most of those people are not like physically powerful compared to, I don't know, some real athlete. And so then you think inside, yeah, well, why are they doing this thing here? It's because that's the easy thing to show, right? It's easy to show that. But the things that really move the needle are those the internal work, the work that creates that alignment between the heart and the mind and the body. And I think that's really important to remember. So it's not just physical things, it's also mental things and emotional things. Focus on systems and not goals. This is one of the simply most helpful things that we can do when it comes to integrating the small habits. The whole Holistal platform is kind of built on putting a system into place that, asks you questions, you're identifying some growth areas, and then there's a suggestion of habits that you could then employ in your life. Putting a system in place can be an extremely helpful way of not only starting your habit forming journey, but also to make things that are going to work over time. So it's extremely helpful to focus on systems. So for instance, I have a little mini system just as an example. So every morning, I'm making my coffee in the morning. I put the kettle on, or put the coffee pot in, and I'm making that happen. And I just do a little bit of, I like yoga, so I do a little bit of morning yoga, right? So I have a 5 to 10 minute window. Well, I could be just standing there or scrolling my Instagram or seeing what's happening overnight. But I spend those few minutes before I do anything with my phone, making the coffee, I put the water in, all that's happening, and then I just do my little yoga sequence, right? So that's just an example of how I have a system in place that makes me at least have stretched a bit and moved a little bit before I start my day. And you can incorporate different kinds of systems in your life that can tie habits together with other activities. Identity-based habits. Identity-based habits are habits that, of course, are linking this whole idea of heart, mind, and body. Now, we've heard the example probably of someone that says, are you a smoker, right? You're either a smoker or you're a non-smoker. If you have the identity of being a non-smoker, right, you're not going to start smoking. Your identity is the person that is non-smoker. You might even say, I'm a healthy person. Well, that whole health identity is something that you then incorporate into your life, and then the habits that you have are built on that. So if you have an identity that is healthy, fit, active, then you're that person, and then the habits will follow, right? You decide the kind of person that you want to be, and then the habits will put into place because of that. The 4 laws of behavior change. we'll leave this now because I think it's just too many different things to incorporate into this. But there are ways to change our behavior. And if you get into Atomic Habits, or if you have us in to do a workshop, we'll dive deeply into actually ways to integrate these things into your life. And habits as the compound interest of self-improvement. This is like one of the key elements is that, as I mentioned earlier, we are working towards something, and it's not just a step-by-step process. As soon as we start to engage things that are good for us, other things come on. So for instance, we'll go to the body because it's an easy example. We're going to the gym. We start to work out. We start to eat better because we're going to the gym. We start to feel better because we're eating better and we're going to the gym, and then it just goes like this, it adds on, right? And then people say, hey, you look great, and then you feel more happy within yourself, right? So this whole kind of process of things can build up. It can be also from the mind. So I know from my experience that I lead a lot of groups and talk a little bit about meditation and mindfulness. And if I don't do my own mindfulness practice, my own meditation on that day, I feel different, right? And as soon as I start to make sure that I always do that, especially if I'm going to do a presentation or talk about mindfulness or the breath or whatever it might be, it makes a huge difference. And then people soon to say, you seem so calm and collected and, ready to talk about things. And I'm like, yeah, that's because I've been doing my practice through time. So it's super helpful to incorporate these things into your life, and they will build. They will build. People will notice it, and then you'll be compounding the different benefits of these things. I'm going to leave you with this idea of mindfulness and the connection between the habits and the microhabits. I believe that there is nothing that is a better example of microhabit than mindfulness. Now, we did a little meditation in the beginning, and mindfulness is that connection point. It is that moment when you sit there, or you stand there, or you walk, or whatever it might be, when you're absolutely in the moment. There's this, a book by Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now. It's being absolutely in the present moment. There are many books by different people talking about mindfulness and the way that we connect with the moment that we are in at this exact second. And we will never be able to relive this moment. So the most true microhabit that we can ever have is to be absolutely present with exactly what we are doing right now. And anything that we employ in our lives, if we are fully present, will make a huge difference on the impact, the attention, and the way that we are able to incorporate, synergize, complete this idea, this circle between the heart, the mind, and the body.